In the military history community, there's a phrase you often run into when people are trying to describe the reason why an army lost a particular battle, campaign, or war. It's said that the army was too busy preparing for the last war. Now, this is a saying you can apply to wars throughout history, but where you really start seeing it applied time and time again is in the Renaissance. The Renaissance is where human technological progress really begins to climb. Knowledge is being discovered and then not lost because it's being written down. And this is the time period where armies and commanders need to be on the cutting edge of technology, because not having the latest technology can cost you the battle or an entire war, depending how far the army is behind. Being behind the technological curve from the Renaissance on is a recipe for disaster. And once humanity hits the Industrial Revolution, being behind the curve goes from being tragic for your army to downright suicidal. There's a term for it. It's known as the dreadnought effect. When some technology or new tactic comes along, that if an army does not have it, they're basically guaranteed to lose whatever campaign they're fighting because they are simply outmatched by their enemies who are employing it against them. Ironically enough, that term comes from the period we're talking about, because in 1905, the British would launch from their dry docks HMS Dreadnought, a battleship that was so much more technologically advanced than anything else afloat. It literally became a dividing line for classifying battleships. There is a pre- and post-Dreadnought in terms of classifying battleships. The Dreadnought's guns were so big and so long-ranged, it could destroy dozens of ships built on previous models before they were even in range to fire back. The closer we get to the present day, we see more and more of these Dreadnought effects throughout the entire army. Whether it be in rifles, cannons, ships, aircraft, technologies, you see Dreadnought effects happening in the middle of the war. The armies that fought in the First and Second World War were radically changed from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. And anyone trying to fight the war the way they fought it in the beginning was doomed to failure due to the massive technological progress seen in those few years of the war. In the lead up to the First World War, the naval arms race was something that even the general public was well aware of, because it's easy to see, wow, look at this big battleship. This thing's so much bigger and scarier than everything we have in our navy, so we need to build bigger battleships to keep up with that. And these countries were bankrupting themselves trying to build enough battleships to contend with their rivals on the sea. But what they didn't really realize was there were plenty of Dreadnought effects that were happening in the army as a whole too, since the last time the major powers of Europe went toe-to-toe in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. Times had changed in those 40 years, and every single one of the armies that marched to battle in 1914 was wholly unprepared for the consequences of technological change, and the result was the death of millions. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of War and Conquest. This is your host, as always, Neil Eckert, and today's episode is our second in our series on the First World War. And the topic of today's episode is World War I was unwinnable on the battlefield. It was a nagging feeling that kept popping up in my research, and so I dedicated this entire episode to showing you why World War I was not decided on the battlefield. All the armies in 1914 were hoping for some decisive blow to knock out their opponent, march on their capital, and impose terms. Instead, what they got was a grinding 4-year war of attrition that bankrupted all of the colonial superpowers, changed the order of the world, and set the ball rolling for the collapse of all of their empires. As Vladimir Lenin would say in 1917, this war will not be won on the battlefield, but in the rear. To truly understand the opening salvos of the First World War, we have to turn the pages of history back to the last time the great powers of Europe would square off, which was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. There had been other conflicts around the world. Most of them were either colonial squabblings or second-rate powers going at it. There was always somebody fighting in the Balkans, and the biggest war that anyone really had to reference was the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. But all of the other major powers basically wrote off Russia as a second-rate power that was riddled with incompetence and was horrifically ineffective on the battlefield, which wasn't far off from the truth. And the Japanese were considered a second-rate power because a few decades before, they were fighting each other with muskets and samurai swords, and no one really ever respected the Japanese power as a military until the lead up to the Second World War. So many of the leading figures in Europe would not take the lessons they should have been learning from this war when it came to planning the First World War. To summarize, the Franco-Prussian War was fought between the Germanic states and the French. Those two peoples had a history of going at it all the way back into ancient times. There have always been people on either side of the Rhine River who have liked to fight each other. These are ancient animosities, and the Franco-Prussian War was simply another expression of that. The French were worried about the rising power of the German states and set out to correct that. And they achieved absolutely none of their goals, and actually the worst-case scenario happened. The French were humiliated in the Battle of Sedan, the emperor was captured, and the German states unified and founded the German Empire. And on top of that, they lost Alsace-Lorraine. Now, this was a massive national embarrassment, and so the military commanders of the time sat down, tried to analyze the Franco-Prussian War, and learn the lessons that needed to be taken to heart in the army to make sure an embarrassment like that never happened again. And unfortunately for the French people, they came to the wrong conclusions. The French looked at what the Germans did and came to the conclusion that the Germans mobilized faster and they outmaneuvered the French in key strategic positions, allowing tragedies like Sedan to happen. So the French would spend the next 40 years preaching what they called the cult of the offensive. Whenever the French army ran into a problem, they would shoot some artillery shells at them, rake the enemy with machine gun fire, and then at them with cavalry and the bayonet. Now, this strategy may have worked pretty well had they been fighting their next war a couple years after the First Franco-Prussian War. Unfortunately for them, times had changed. And in the 40 years in between the Franco-Prussian War and the outbreak of the First World War, there had been massive changes in all arms of the military that made that kind of tactic completely obsolete and suicidal for the men who participated in it. Now, when people talk about the First World War, the machine gun is what gets a lot of the credit. And rightfully so. Machine guns are devastating to frontally attacking infantry and cavalry. Anything you have that's going to spew out a few hundred rounds a minute is going to devastate anyone running straight at them. And I am not at all discounting the part that machine guns played in the First World War. It is definitely part of the puzzle of why nobody could really break through the lines on either side, no matter how many artillery shells they shot at the position and how many men they sent to their deaths. What I am saying is, it's not the only piece of the puzzle. Aside from the machine guns, what made the frontal attack so disastrous and casualty-heavy was the increase in killing power that your average infantryman had in his hands. In the Franco-Prussian War, both sides used what are known as needle guns. They're basically the in-between step of evolution from the muzzle-loading firearms that you see in like the American Civil War and the bolt-action rifles you see in the First World War. It is a contained pouch of powder with a shell in it where the needle strikes the back of the powder and fires it out. The breech is then opened, another pouch can be put in, and it can be fired again. The French had a little bit better version of this, but both sides were more or less equally armed in the Franco-Prussian War, and your average infantryman could fire between 5 to 8 shots in a minute, which is about double what your average soldier could do with a muzzleloader. Very nice. That's a great improvement of killing power. By the end of the Franco-Prussian War to the start of the First World War, every single one of the powers was equipped with stripper clip-fed bolt-action rifles. The discovery that allowed this was smokeless powder. Smokeless powder is a bit of an oxymoron because there's still a little bit of smoke, but compared to something like black powder, it's almost negligible. Smokeless powder also burns cleaner, meaning that you get more energy coming out of the cartridge, meaning it fires cleaner, allowing for far more complex systems. You can make things like a lever action or a bolt action or a gas-powered semi-automatic or fully automatic rifle with smokeless powder. If you tried to make a black powder machine gun, it would probably jam after 25 or 30 shots from all the powder fouling, and it would literally be impossible to see in front of you from all of the smoke. With the invention of smokeless powder, your average rifleman's rate of fire went from 5 to 8 rounds a minute to 15 to 20. And there were even some rifle experts that could achieve far higher totals in a minute. The British Army is famous for this because not only did they have the amazingly fast-cycling SMLE rifle, they also heavily incentivized rapid fire. They had something known as the Mad Minute. It was a timed exercise. You had to fire as many aimed shots in a minute as you can. And the record holder in the British Army was capable of 39 hits in a minute. If we're just doing a little bit of math here, is 5 times the rate of fire of your average soldier in the Franco-Prussian War. So you expand that out, a company of attacking infantry is being received by a defending company that can put out the rate of fire of a battalion in the old days. You combine that together with the machine gun, and frontal assaults go from downright reckless to utterly catastrophic. But what jumps it up from utterly catastrophic to suicidal is when we throw in artillery to the mix of the killing power of the infantry company in 1914. Because rifles weren't the only things that had vastly improved since the Franco-Prussian War. Artillery had also benefited from the smokeless powder revolution. All these countries began tweaking with propellants in this era. Artillery used to be a line-of-sight cannon, where you could basically just fire at anything you could see with a relatively slow reload time. Now all of these cannons could be loaded from the breech. You throw a shell in there, throw a powder pack, close the breech, and you can fire again. Not only can you fire faster with these more modern artillery pieces, you can also fire far further into the distance. You can shoot out of visual sight. Ranges of cannons go from hundreds of meters to kilometers, with the bigger guns being able to go dozens of kilometers. The most famous pieces in the First World War were the Paris guns that fired over 70 kilometers to drop shells on Paris from the German front lines. Artillery had also benefited from the invention of dynamite. Explosives before the invention of dynamite were mostly nitroglycerin-based, which is highly unstable. You try to put something like that in a cannon, you're going to end up blowing up the cannon and killing your crew. With the invention of the high explosive shell, artillery had taken another drastic leap forward in killing power. And not only could the shells explode now, it also allowed these armies to develop what was known as the shrapnel shell, which is the great-great-grandson of grape and canister shot. It is a shell that's shot out of the cannon, and about 75% of the way to the target, it explodes in the air like a giant shotgun shell, raining down hot pieces of metal going at supersonic speeds at anything below where the shell exploded. It is absolutely devastating to infantry in the open. As all of the combatants would find out to their horror in the early days in the maneuver warfare phase of the war, before the trenches, before everybody dug in, and they were still charging at each other in the fields, the absolutely devastating effect of artillery became well known quickly. And while we're on the topic of artillery, we have to discuss the different types, because the type of cannon you use against the enemy is very important. And they break down into 3 major groups. You have field guns, howitzers, and mortars. At the beginning of the war, The most common type is the field gun. I don't know how this analogy is going to work for those outside of the United States, but if you go past your local VFW or American Legion or some kind of veterans hall, sometimes they have a tank out front, or sometimes they have an artillery piece. Little tiny thing they usually have out there, decommissioned, I would hope. And if you've ever seen one of those, you've seen a field gun. Field guns are light, they're easy to move around, they're usually drawn by a team of 1 or 2 horses, or in a pinch, even the artillery crew can lift it up and move it around for short distances. Field guns are direct fire weapons. The best place to put them is on the top of a hill where you have a long line of sight where you can drop shells on a visible enemy. Or if you're at the base of the hill and the enemy is charging down the hill, they are also easy to hit if that's where you're set up. Because a field gun's trajectory when it fires its shell is much like a rifle, where the round leaves the chamber and then arcs gently towards the target. It's a little bit more pronounced in a field gun shell, but the best way to deploy these is when the enemy is visible and you can fire directly at them. You're on the other side of an open field, the enemy tries to bayonet charge you, throw a few shrapnel shells in there, and bayonet charges no more. The drawback of the field gun is either when the enemy is behind a hill or they have decided to dig in to get away from your shells. Because of the direct line of fire, it's very hard to hit an enemy that has decided to dig a foxhole or a trench. And as you may imagine, the armies of Europe were scrambling to replace their field guns when the trench war started, because all of a sudden their artillery had suffered a drastic drop in effectiveness. Although that was only the case when the enemy was in the trenches. If the enemy decided to get out of the trenches and charge across no man's land, all of a sudden the field guns are once again worth their weight in gold. Their over-reliance on the field gun is part of the problem that the French army faced in the early phases of the war, because the field gun went along perfectly with the French cult of the offensive idea. Their idea was to have fast-moving forces that would move and attack decisive weak points with infantry charges and cavalry, and their idea was to have the field gun travel slightly behind the attacking infantry. The infantry or cavalry advances forward, punches a hole, and the artillery crew picks up stakes and charges into that breach with the infantry, sets up again, rinse and repeat until the enemy is surrounded and destroyed. The German army, on the other hand, took a far different view, and they invested more in the howitzer. This is part of a trend of the German army being far better prepared for World War I than any of the other forces. Now, that's not to say they were entirely prepared. They were just as shocked with some of the discoveries learned by all the armies as everyone else, but part of why the Germans were so well prepared for this war is they had been planning for it for years. See, after the Franco-Prussian War, the French would erect a bunch of fortresses along the border with France and Germany as part of their plan to slow down the German army long enough for the entire French populace to mobilize to throw them out of French territory. So, the Germans decided to do a little outflanking maneuver and invade Belgium and the Netherlands. Now, in Belgium, there were a lot of these super advanced subterranean forts that had pillboxes and hidden artillery positions that could open up these big steel trapdoors, fire, and then close again before the counter-battery fire could respond. They were seen as cutting edge, and they were rated up to the highest caliber in the world at the time. So the Germans did the logical thing and just built bigger guns. And it's because the Germans knew they would be dealing with these fortresses in both France and Belgium that they decided to invest more heavily in the howitzer. Now, the howitzer is basically the opposite of the field gun. It fires in a much higher arc to drop its shell onto the enemy. Generally speaking, howitzers are much larger. Field guns are meant to be light and maneuverable, and howitzers are meant to pulverize whatever they're aiming at. And because of the higher trajectory of the way their shells drop, they are very good at hitting enemies that are entrenched, hiding behind hills, or digging themselves underground into bunkers. They're slower to move and they're slower firing, but in a trench war, a howitzer is something you want to have if you're trying to shell the enemy into oblivion. But it suffers more in the direct fire role. If the enemy is attacking, the higher trajectory of the shell means the shells drop on target slower, and the enemy can hear the shell coming. There's that whistle that accompanies the shell that allows everyone involved to hit the deck or dive into a hole or a dugout before it hits. So unless you directly hit what you're aiming at, the enemy can survive it. And then there's the third category of artillery, which is the mortar. Now, the mortar has by far the greatest variety out of all three of the artillery pieces, because they can range from anything from these little tiny handheld setups that can shoot a couple pound, basically hand grenade, a few 100 meters into the enemy positions, all the way up to these giant siege mortars that look more like a cooking kettle than anything else, that fire giant shells that are meant to destroy supposedly bomb-proof bunkers. They also have the added benefit of being far cheaper than the other two types of artillery, meaning they can be far more mass-produced and spread out more evenly along the lines. Just to give you a little perspective, before the opening of the 1918 German Spring Offensive, the Germans had 6,000 field guns and howitzers and 12,000 mortars take part in the bombardment. The craziest looking one is the English. It was known by the Germans as the toffee apple because it shot a shell that looks almost like a cast iron pan. It's got a big bulbous head to it, and the whole thing fires in one piece. It looks, well, like a toffee apple. That is one of the things I found in my research I was very happy for, because all those years of reading Ernst Junger, he was talking about toffee apples. I thought they were a type of grenade. No, it just turns out to be one of the most insane mortar designs I've ever seen in my entire military history career. The Germans hated them, so they must have hated them for a reason, meaning they were most likely effective at what they did. So I guess looks aren't everything. So, to best sum up this whole section on artillery, I want to relate to you a story I found in Karl Marlantis's book, What It's Like to Go to War. Now, Marlantis was a Marine Corps lieutenant in the Vietnam War, but he tells this one story that I think perfectly sums up this whole discussion about artillery. One day he was operating as an artillery observer. He was flying around in a little Piper Cub plane, flying low to try to spot and destroy NVA positions. His pilot flies over, he sees this bunker compound on a hill, and he gets on the radio. The only thing that can answer and drop artillery for him is a cruiser that's floating offshore. He sends in the coordinates, the cruiser blasts the hill with its 12-inch guns, and just absolutely tears everything up. The trees are destroyed, soil's thrown everywhere, and there are several direct hits on the bunker compound. Marlantis gets on the radio, tells the cruiser they did a good job, the bunkers are still intact, but it'll be an easy job for the Air Force to fly over and drop a couple bombs and end the whole thing. Now, the story goes on, the skipper of the ship repeatedly ordering Marlantis to fly back over because there's absolutely no way all of those shells he shot from his cruiser didn't destroy the bunker complex. And eventually, after the third pass getting shot at by the now very alert NVA soldiers on the ground, Marlantis decides to lie, switch channels, and call in an airstrike. 2 bombs later, the entire bunker complex is destroyed. And that right there is the difference between shelling a position with a howitzer and a siege mortar. Because even with the 12-inch naval guns absolutely destroying everything on the hill, they still could not achieve that angle to fall directly on top of these concrete bunkers that were buried underground. But they did a great job of exposing it, so something that was dropping around straight into it could just obliterate the entire thing. And that is what the siege mortars were great at. They fire their projectile way up in the air, it comes straight down, and if you direct hit a bunker, no matter how deep they dug into the ground, they're screwed. The only drawback of the mortar is they're generally pretty short range. You're looking at ranges of only 1,000 or 2 meters at the most for these big heavy ones, while the howitzers and field guns can fire much farther away. And it's the mix of all three of these types of artillery that changed the First World War from one of maneuver to one that exists underground in the trenches. Entrenching is basically a harnessing of the animal instinct inside all of us to go underground to escape a predator. Like a rabbit hiding from a flock of hawks circling above head, the safest place is underground. Between the rifles, machine guns, and artillery, if it's death to stay above ground in the open for too long, well, hiding underground is the most logical thing to do. The problem is, while it's safe to be underground, you can't really move the needle of the war one way or the other if both sides just hunker down in their trenches and lob artillery shells and sniper rounds at each other. You can kill a few people that way, but you're not going to win any wars that way. And the French especially struggled with these concepts throughout the war, not only because of the cult of the offensive, but because the Germans were occupying their territory. The first month of the war, the Germans made incredible territorial gains as they pushed the enemy all the way back to the Marne River. There's the miracle of the Marne. The French and English finally get enough reserves together to push the Germans back, and that's where the lines stabilize. In a line that stretches from Switzerland all the way to Belgium, these become the battlegrounds of the Western Front. The trenches would pop up shortly afterwards, and it looked like a giant zigzag scar going across Europe. And as the years progressed, the trench system would get more and more advanced, and the power of the defensive became even greater. At the end of the day, that is what this entire episode is about. The fact that military development far favored the defensive over the offensive in the period of the First World War. By the Second World War, there's more trucks, there's half-tracks, there's tanks, there's planes, paratroopers. It becomes more of a war of maneuver because the technology to conduct offensives has caught up and outpaced the technology of the defensive. But in the First World War, none of these things exist. In the first 2 years of the war, the trench systems aren't super advanced, but neither side really has enough men or material to dislodge the other. Both of the armies were spent in 1914 from their great offensives pushing each other back and forth in the Battle of the Frontier. By 1915, the trenches are dug in, but the strategy for attack has not really been hammered out yet. The generals and officers on the ground don't really know how to overcome the field problem of the system of trenches. And by the time they begin to figure that out, the trench systems have been expanded. The ability of the defense in depth is so great that no combination of incredible assault tactics can overcome them. And to understand this, I want to take us through the eyes of an infantry company or division that is trying to assault the trenches in 1917 or 18. Because by then, the tactics for taking the frontline trenches were fine-tuned about as well as they can be with the technology of the time. So I figure the best way to explain this is to just experience what it would be like to try to take these multiple layers of defense in depth. So after the artillery bombardment is over, the whistles blow and the offensives begin. The first challenge your infantryman has to face is no man's land itself. It's a morass that has been churned up by years of pounding and millions of shells landing on it. There's giant craters everywhere, there's debris from battles in the past, and depending on where you were, every shell hole could be an inescapable pit of quicksand. Especially if you're looking at these offensives that take place along the English section of the line in Flanders. You know, it's not called the Low Countries for nothing. The water table there is very high, and both sides had these great struggles with this soupy mud that would form in both the trenches and in no man's land. Because the people who lived there before had barely drained it enough to have it work as farmland, and now you have all of these shells blowing things open, they're destroying the dams and bogs that had held back all this water, and the whole thing just becomes a flooded mess. If you fall into the wrong shell hole, it's literally quicksand. It's mud so deep it's inescapable. Like men would fall in, and no matter what anybody tried to do, there's no getting them out again. They would just slowly go mad as they were sucked deeper and deeper into the depths. To the point where most guys, when they got stuck in there, begged their comrades to just shoot them in the head before they went insane, slowly being sucked to their death. So that's the first obstacle. On top of that, these battle lines have changed, so you have to run into some of the old trenches that are filled with the dead and rotting remains of the people who manned them before. And all of these shell holes, even if you don't get sucked into the quicksand like mud, the water is tainted by human waste, rotting, decomposing people, and any gas that may have dissipated elsewhere usually collects in the bottom of these pools, meaning all of this water is incredibly toxic. But let's say we get past that. The next obstacle, barbed wire. Now, we're not just talking about a simple cow fence that goes around pasture lands to stop the cows from escaping. We're talking about 4 years worth of buildup of this incredible fortress of barbed wire. At the beginning of the war, most people really didn't think barbed wire would be one of those technological inventions that came about before the war that would have that big of an impact. And yet it does. Because barbed wire is simple. It's cheap. It's easy to produce. If you know what you're doing and you have gloves, it's easy to set up. And it's surprisingly effective at stopping an infantry charge in its tracks, because people don't like running into wire with a bunch of spikes on it any more than cows do. And these great forests of barbed wire would grow up throughout the years. They would start out as simple stakes with single, double, or triple strands run through them, but then you could put a coil around those, and then you could build these pillars with stakes to make these basic columns of barbed wire that you could string wire in any direction. The British loved to do this one thing called the recessed pit, where they would set a bunch of stakes above ground to let the enemy worm its way through while they got ripped to pieces by grenades and rifle and machine gun bullets. They would finally get through that. They would have to go over a little hill, only to discover another section of barbed wire that was laid underground, like a Burmese tiger pit. And at this point, the men in the trenches can basically throw their bullets at you and hit you. And on top of that, you have whatever the artillery has done to the barbed wire. And because as these barbed wire forests came up, the brilliant idea the generals had was to simply blow them up with artillery. And there would be a bunch of different experiments about which shells worked best. And the British would find out the hard way that shrapnel shells do almost nothing to cut barbed wire. That was their brilliant idea in the preliminary bombardment to the Battle of the Somme. They had all these shrapnel shells for their field guns laying around, so they spent a week dropping shrapnel shells on the German lines, hoping it would win them an open door with all the barbed wire cut, only to find out when the whistles blew that almost all of the barbed wire was still in place, and they lost 60,000 men in the first day of the battle. So, when that experiment failed, they would switch to high explosive shells. Problem is, with high explosive shells, they only trigger when they hit the ground, because they need enough force to activate the fuse to blow them up. But when you do that, it throws the barbed wire in the air in unpredictable positions, and it may end up making the barbed wire obstacle far worse than it was to begin with. Instead of these orderly lines with coils wrapped around them, the artillery has now made basically a giant honeysuckle clump of barbed wire that's even more impassable than it was before. But as the war goes on, the artillery works develop a shell that has a far lighter fuse that basically anything that touches it is going to explode this shell. So now the shells can hit one layer of barbed wire, air burst, and more effectively flatten the obstacle in front of the trenches. But even if all of that goes swimmingly, you still have the firing line to assault through. Now these firing lines are built a lot like castles. And really, the entire First World War goes from a war of battles to one giant siege if you really look at it. It's probably part of what really appeals to me about this war, given my general love of sieges. This was a siege that took 4 years and killed 14 million people. And the front rows of the trenches were designed much like a castle rampart. These trenches are not just these straight ditches that just go for miles on miles. They are zigzagged. Now this is for several reasons. The first is to limit the damage that a direct hit on the trench from an artillery shell can do. Because even if it falls dead center of the trench and explodes, its shrapnel pattern can only damage 5 to 10 foot area. Someone around the corner is going to get knocked on their ass, but they're likely going to survive. Unless it's one of those really big shells where the concussion can kill you around the corner. It's also so that if an enemy jumps into the trench or stands at the top lip of the trench, they cannot simply just fire down the line with a light machine gun and just rake everybody there. They have to take each individual corner in order to command the front line of the trench. They would also build listening posts out in the middle of the wire where they could observe wire parties or raids coming in, or during an assault you can put some guys in there with grenades to just lob some more death onto the guys trying to struggle through the barbed wire entanglements. Then after that you have the machine gun pits that are on the parts of the trench that stick out further. They're like parapets on a castle wall, and they're built with the same principle as those towers on a castle. It allows you to fire both forward and sideways. Give the enemy coming up on the trench a little taste of enfilading fire, which means firing along the axis of their advance, meaning that you basically can't miss. If you got a bunch of guys running at you in a staggered line, you can just aim in the middle of them with your machine gun, close your eyes even, and you'll still knock down half of them because you're hitting them broadside with bullets. This is also great if they're sitting there with their wire cutters trying to chop through the last layers of wire before the front line of the firing trench. They're just sitting ducks. The machines can just rake them all day long. Which is why in the training done before all these great offensives, a lot of time is spent in grenade training. Because the infantry throughout the war has found that's the best way to attack these fortified positions. Take cover and just launch a few dozen grenades at the machine gun nests and all of these listening posts, and you drastically reduce the casualties. You don't even have to stick your head above the trench. Just pop the pin or pull the arming cap on the end of the potato masher and just chuck it up in the air and wait for the boom. Grenades are also great for going around corners or clearing in dugouts that might have some guy with a light machine gun inside waiting to just hose whoever comes past the opening like a sweaty Rainbow Six Siege player. So taking the front line trenches is hard. After all, they were designed to stop people from taking them. But usually with the combination of artillery bombardment beforehand and all of the explosives that are being chucked at them every minute, the frontline trenches fall. And it gets to the point that most of the commanders during these offensives lightly garrison the front lines anyway because they expect them to fall. That's a problem that a lot of the commanders make in the early stages of the war. They follow that old idea of defending the front, where they imagine themselves as, men locking their shields together in the shield wall, and if anyone gives in the front line, the whole battle is lost. And so they take massive casualties from the artillery bombardment because the artillery is aimed at these frontline trenches that are filled with people who are packed into these underground dugouts, and if the dugout goes down, you're losing 50, 60, 70 guys at a time. But later in the war, these armies are adopting new strategies by lightly garrisoning the front lines, expecting them to just get absolutely ripped to shreds by the artillery, and stopping the enemy on the second and third line of trenches. So beyond the firing line, you have the living quarters. The frontline trenches don't really have any dugouts because they're all about thickness. Most of these frontline trenches, at least if they're built according to the code in the British manual, have to be a minimum of 9 feet thick. They dig out the dirt, they put it in the front of the trench, and it's basically bulletproof. Even with the heavy-duty armor-piercing rounds, it's not going through 9 feet of dirt. And the men's sleeping positions are a little bit behind, and they're connected by what are known as communication trenches. Communication trenches are the arteries of the trench system. And these are the ways to safely move up reinforcements, supplies, bring out wounded men, or bringing in the night's food to the men. The communication trenches are the lifeblood of the trenches, and they are also built to be defended. Communication trenches zigzag like the front lines do as well, for the same principle, although they have a more gentle zigzag slope than the frontline trenches do. They are still made so that if they get hit directly with an artillery shell, the men can survive, or if men are advancing or retreating, they can't be pinned down by a single machine gun. What they would also do to defend these things is every now and again they would dig something known as a traverse trench. This is something where you could set up some grenadiers and a machine gun there, and as the front lines are pulling back, you can offer covering fire to your men as they fall back to the next line of defenses. And you can hold up the men who have taken the frontline trenches as they form up to assault the next lines. And all of this is made to delay. Every single one of these defenses is not meant to stop the enemy outright. It's meant to buy more time for the line behind you. These defense systems are set up in tiers so they can slow down an enemy assault long enough that the reserves can be moved into the position and can be sent in to counterattack when the moment is right. The strategy is to basically lose the front trench, to make the enemy suffer enough casualties that you break up cohesion. As they keep pushing into layer and layers of defense, they are getting pounded more and more. Their officers and NCOs are dying. Unit cohesion is breaking down. The men are getting tired. They're running out of ammo. And then they can be counterattacked at the right time and driven back to their starting positions. And that's what the secondary, the support line, and the reserve lines are for. Now, the textbook trench system may have 3 separate lines in them. In some of these places where there were continual offensives, these defenses could go for miles. You might have a line that extends back 5 kilometers. There'd be a trench, communication trenches, about a 500-600 meter gap, another set of trenches, and then another gap, and then another set of trenches, and then so on and so forth. Because on the Western Front, the same places got attacked repeatedly, either because there was a valuable strategic objective behind them, it was the junction between the 2 lines, which was a favorite place for the Germans to attack. They loved attacking the junction point of the English and French lines. Or it was just wherever the terrain was suitable. I mean, a lot of the lines in the First World War are separated by canals or rivers, so there's just really no way to assault across that, unless you're planning on having your men deploy hundreds of boats in an area that's bracketed by hundreds of field guns and howitzers. So these same places get attacked over and over again. Ypres, the Marne, the Somme, Champagne, Arras. These are all places that have been attacked and counterattacked multiple times, and so the defenses have been built up accordingly. And as we said, all of them are designed to slow down the enemy attack, to just take more and more of that momentum out of the offensive punch until it is too weak and can be pushed back. Similar to how Kevlar is. Kevlar is just a bunch of different layers of fabric woven together to take all the energy out of a bullet and make it non-lethal. The problem was, even if all of these defenses were overcome, the attacking forces simply did not have the level of technology needed to exploit the breakthroughs that were made. I mean, the German Spring Offensive of 1918 is the most successful series of battles in the entire war, where 20, 30, 40, even 50 kilometers of ground is taken, but the Germans simply cannot exploit all of their gains because they lack the technology to do so. Because in a way, the trench system is the ultimate field problem, not only in breaking through the trench lines, but also moving reinforcements, supplies, medical personnel, and your artillery forward once that breakthrough is made. They can punch through some of these lines, but what do you do once you do that? Once the majority of your special stormtroopers have been killed or wounded taking the trenches, you have men who aren't as well led, or their officers have already been killed. They've been lumped into a conglomerated unit of whatever survivors there is. They have no real way to communicate with command. Chaos reigns, and even poorly led and ill-informed groups of survivors that decide to just pick a hedgerow to make a stand in can turn back forces far larger than themselves. Because once you break through the trench system, you have the same problem that forced both sides into the trenches in the first place, is that it's suicide to be above ground in the open in view of the enemy. Now, John Toland does a great job of explaining this problem in his book 1918. And John Toland does a lot to get as many primary sources from the survivors of these battles as possible. He's full of stories in the aftermath of Operation Michael of confused British and Portuguese and French soldiers just sort of stumbling around. They're shooting at their own men, but then the Germans come and they lay down some machine gun fire or call in artillery and just decimate whoever's in front of them. And by some miracle, they kill enough men that they can withdraw and rejoin the rest of the army that they're supposed to be with. So what is the answer to the ultimate field problem of the trenches? We've discussed it at length already. I always hate to simply nitpick something wrong and then do nothing about it. I'm a type of person who's like, well, if you're going to state a problem, you should try to think of a solution. So I sat around and I've come up with a hypothetical way that World War I could have been won on the battlefield. So in our hypothetical, we're going to go into the year 1919. We're going to say that Ludendorff never launches the spring offensive. He still has all of his men on hand, and we are trying to arm, equip, and train an American division to create a breakthrough in the German lines. Now, I'm not picking the Americans just because that's the home team. As I've said before, I'm rooting for the Germans in World War I because, honestly, they deserve that win. Like, they were the army that was the most prepared, the most well-trained, the best equipped of the war, and the consequences of them losing the First World War are horrifying. World War II, with 4 times the casualties and a bunch more genocides. But I'm choosing the Americans because in 1919 would have the most men, the only country that wasn't bankrupt, and had the industrial capacity to change the way of doing things. And I've come up with 5 key things that would be needed to both create a breakthrough in the lines and further exploit said breakthrough enough that the army would collapse and would sue for peace. The first and most important on this list, radios. It doesn't seem like that would be the most important weapon you can have in this fight, but the ability to communicate via radio is the fundamental necessity of maneuver warfare. You can't maneuver effectively without some form of radio communication with your men, especially when the command center is dozens of kilometers behind the front line and the front being attacked on is multiple miles wide. In the First World War, there were 3 main forms of communication. There was the telephone, the flare gun, and the aerial observer. Now, the telephones were nice. An officer in his dugout could call for reinforcements, resupply, or bombardment should he need it. But the telephone has several drawbacks. The first being, you need a telephone line. That telephone line is susceptible to being cut by any of the millions of pieces of shrapnel that are flying through the sky, or the millions of artillery shells falling on the ground. The wire gets cut, they're screwed. You gotta send a poor guy out there to try to find where the wire is broken to mend it. Even if it's buried underground, some of these shells are heavy enough that, by chance, they find that needle in the haystack and cut the wire. Even if the wire remains uncut before the offensive, as soon as the officer steps off to go to the attack, he is no longer in communication with his superiors. He must rely on either shooting flares into the air to try to signal people in the rear, or sending a runner back through the hell that is no man's land to try to get a message to a telephone operator. And with all the bullets flying through the air of the defenders and the artillery shells landing in no man's land, there's no guarantee that guy's going to get there with the message intact. Or even if he does, he might beat all the odds, run back into the dugout only to find the telephone line has been cut by the artillery shells. The only other method of communicating with command is aerial observers. Now, some of these planes did have a rudimentary form of radio. It was basically a one-way telegraph box that used wireless technology to tap out simple artillery corrections or information to go back to command. It didn't always work, and with its extra weight, it made the aircraft a bit unstable. I mean, these are planes that are barely flying fast enough to achieve enough lift to stay in the air, and so many of these pilots just opted to not have that extra weight in their cockpit and would rely on having to fly over enemy positions, have their co-pilot in the back seat write down a message, put it in a tube, fly back over their lines, and then just chuck that tube over the side of the plane and wait for somebody on the ground to pick it up. As you can imagine, a very inefficient way of communicating with the artillery and command. So my idea is to have some form of this portable radio that is in the planes being carried by an infantryman. Now, we can't expect a walkie-talkie because the two-way radio as we know it today wasn't invented until 1937. But even if you have a one-way radio with the officer being able to send simple telegraph messages back to command would make maneuver warfare that much easier. He could report casualties or tell his own artillery our own shells are falling on our men, which happened all the time as these offensives went forward. Because eventually, if the offensive is successful enough, they outpace their guns. And either the artillery fires on its own men accidentally because they're firing in the dark, or they just refuse to fire because they don't want to hit their own men. Either way, farther they advance, the less and less fire support they get from the rear, as the field guns and mortars are now outranged, and the only thing that can still drop shells on the enemy are the heaviest of the howitzers. Now, this may be wishful thinking here, imagining that we could make a portable radio that an infantryman could carry on his back, but if they could put it in a plane that can barely keep itself in the air as it is, I think, you get a big hulking guy and send him across no man's land with it. Maybe the officers can communicate with the rear. That one's probably the biggest hypothetical out of the 5 we're going to discuss here, but the lack of radio communication is what screws up every one of these offensives. Because the commanders in the rear are getting information hours or days after it was sent to them, and they cannot make informed decisions about what's going on at the front because they just don't have enough information. To go back to an earlier example, just imagine the Battle of the Somme had the commanders been receiving radio reports from all the way up and down the line saying the barbed wire's not cut, we're all just walking to our deaths. Maybe 60,000 men don't have to die in an afternoon. The second improvement is far more achievable. It's adding more firepower to the assaulting forces. And to achieve this, the American military just needs to do the same thing it was doing in actual time. Equip its men with more shotguns, Thompson submachine guns, and BARs. It was already doing this on a smaller scale, but production lagged behind, and some of the commanders were afraid that the Germans were going to get their hands on them and reverse engineer them. If the war continues another year, those attitudes might go away as soon as the commanders realize just how limited the German industrial capacity was at this point in the war anyway. So you get more companies and platoons armed with BARs, Thompsons, and trench guns. They're going to do a lot more damage as they assault the frontline trenches. Plus, we can't forget that 1919, we have the improved Browning medium machine gun, the one that the US troops would carry into the Second World War, with its air-cooled barrel that was far more portable than the 1917 version. This may just be adding to the gun wish list, but maybe with the extra pressure of the war, Browning invents the M2 1921 50 caliber machine gun that much earlier. That might be stretching, but we're putting it on the wish list. If anyone can do it, it's John Browning. The effectiveness of up-arming these American assault battalions is seen in the Second World War, when the Americans were bringing semi and fully automatic weapons to a war where most other people were fighting with bolt-action rifles. Now, maybe that strategy doesn't work super well if you're fighting across long distances, but in the up-close and personal trench fighting of the First World War, these guns could shine like never before. Especially considering how terrible some of the other light machine guns during the war were. I mean, the Lewis gun is great. I'm not going to say anything bad about the Lewis gun, but you've got guns like the French Shawshat, which has a magazine so terrible, if you grip it too hard, you stop the cartridges from being able to feed through because the magazine is so thin. You compare that next to the BAR firing God's caliber 30-06, and it's a night and day difference in combat effectiveness of the assaulting units. So ideas 3 and 4 are kind of in the same vein. They follow a similar technological tree, basically. And idea 3 is self-propelled artillery. Now, I'm not expecting self-propelled artillery as we know it today, or even like the Second World War, where it's basically just a tank chassis with a gun on top of it. My idea is more a transporting craft to take the artillery pieces across no man's land and bring them closer to the front of the fighting. And this would be doable because all they would really have to do is take the existing technology and alter it a little bit. They were already using the Mark I tanks, which was the first tank the British employed. It's that big rhombus, school bus length tank that moves about as fast as a man walking. Now they make it this big so it could cross trenches. It's long enough that its tracks can stay on the ground on both ends of the trenches. And we're going to need this, because even if it is slower than a walking pace, it's still faster than the horses could get across no man's land. Because this is the problem. You have this area that's hard enough for infantry to cross. It's all churned up. There's holes everywhere. And now you have to get a team of horses dragging behind these heavy field pieces, and they're getting stuck and falling in holes, and the horses are getting lame because they're stepping on shrapnel or, the other debris that's littering the battlefield. If we put the artillery in the tanks, it has a much better chance of getting safely across no man's land. So you just take the Mark I chassis or something similar to it, chop the top of it off, put a loading gate on it, and you have a design that's basically like an Amtrak, where you can load up a couple field guns inside the tank, strap them down, and then have the crew drive over the trenches and deliver the field guns closer to the front where they can be used to drop shells on the enemy again. Now you might say, well, why don't they just build more tanks so you can put the guns in the tank? Well, the tanks of the First World War were slow, prone to mechanical issues, and they have a whole bunch of other host of issues where they were good at breaking through the first couple lines, but by then, most of them were either shot to hell with armor-piercing bullets, blown up by the artillery, or they simply just broke down. Or the crew was hallucinating from carbon monoxide poisoning because some of the early models of the tank, for some brilliant reason, piped the exhaust into the tank. So after a half an hour, the entire crew is hallucinating and choking and having to take a break outside in the fresh air. You eliminate that problem if you chop the top off, and you don't need a super fast tank because we're not assaulting anything here. We're just using the tank chassis to move field guns forward, and maybe you can load some wounded in there and bring them back to the front line. It's not a super elegant design, but it's effective. It brings the guns to the front where they're needed, and it allows the impetus of the assault to move forward. Option 4 is in a similar vein, and that is the armored personnel carrier. Now this one is a little bit tricky to work out too, because even the best tanks, like the Whippets, which were the small two-person light tanks that were supposed to be the open warfare tanks, only move slightly faster than like the big lumbering beasts. But they have the issue is they can't directly cross these trenches unless you have an engineering crew going ahead and filling these trenches with bundles of wood, or they're building pontoon bridges across the trenches. These tanks would struggle to get into the rear. You can't even say like, oh yeah, just take a modern tank back to World War I, because it's going to have the same problem. Most of them are going to get stuck in the trenches, or fall into a shell hole, or any number of other bad things that can happen to a tank. Which is why I said that the trenches are the ultimate field problem. They're good at both stopping the attack, and even if the attack breaks through, it's hard to get reinforcements and supplies where they're needed at the new front line. These armies need some kind of armored personnel carrier because the defensive advancements had made cavalry obsolete, but the role of the cavalryman was still needed, if that makes any sense. Through most of human history, since we domesticated the horse, cavalry has had one of three roles, either as a scout, a messenger, or to pursue fleeing enemies. There's an occasional fourth one depending on your culture, and that's the shock cavalry, but we're not really worried about that right now. This problem comes up several times in both 1914 and 1918, because the enemies are broken, the lines have been punched through. This is the perfect time where you send in the cavalry to save the day, to outflank the fleeing enemy, capture bridge heads and stop them from retreating and take prisoners. And this is the time for the cavalry to finally shine after 4 years of war, and all these cavalry divisions just get decimated by a couple of guys in a ditch with a machine gun. The need for cavalry was still there, but the protection that allowed them to survive long enough to do their job simply was not there. Hence, the need for the armored personnel carrier. And it doesn't even have to be elegant. It can be something simple like the M113, just a box with tracks on it that you can fit a dozen guys in the back of and can shake off machine gun shells and light shrapnel explosions until they get up to the front. Drop the gate out, let them out, and send them into the fight. I mean, hell, even if they had enough trucks, they can achieve a similar result as long as you can get the trucks through the trench system. But they couldn't, because trucks have just as much trouble as anything else getting over trenches, and they didn't have enough trucks anyway. The trucks were so valuable, they're kept farther behind, and they're just used to ferry men from the train depots to the reserve lines and back again. You see, even as we're going right now, I'm kind of defeating some of my own arguments here. Like, even going into hypothetical land and using modern ideas of battle and tactics, the problem of the trenches is too difficult to overcome. I mean, hell, look at the Ukrainian war. Neither side can get a breakthrough, even with the modern technology. Neither side has enough of a technological or equipment edge to break the other. And so they just keep pushing against each other and grinding themselves down until one of them gives up, which is exactly how the First World War ended. But before we get too depressed with modern events, we have my fifth and final idea, and that is the cargo plane. Now for this, we're going to have to retrofit some of the heavy bombers that were used by both sides in this war. Because planes had already been invented that could drop several hundred pounds worth of bombs. They had enough lift and engine power to go on bombing runs, so my idea is to open up those bomb bay doors and drop supplies to the frontline men. Now, parachute technology is still a little bit shaky, although they did have them on the flare guns to allow the illumination shells to fall to the ground slower, so they could probably rig up some rudimentary parachutes, or worst case scenario, just wrap them in enough linen or wool and just fly low and slow enough to drop them out of the bottom of the plane. The idea for a cargo drop is you eliminate the problem of the trenches. You know, if you can't get trucks or tanks or vehicles to drive over the trenches to bring in supplies, just fly over them. A lot of times during these offensives, the commanders would make sure that there was local air superiority. They'd put all their planes in this one area, sweep the planes out of the sky, and then go on bombing and strafing runs into the rear. So if they can achieve air superiority, you can have your cargo planes come in flying low and slow, drop some supplies out of the bottom, and the men can have enough food and ammunition to continue their assaults forward. I would say they could put grenades in the boxes and drop them out, but I feel like with the rudimentary parachute, you're basically just going to be bombing your own men at that point by, making some of those grenades go off in their own boxes. All of it's wishful thinking anyway, but that's what happens when we go down the hypothetical rabbit hole. This exercise was more to show you guys just how ridiculous finding a solution to this war is. There is no answer. The greatest military minds of the day put every part of their being into finding a way to overcome the defensive network of the First World War on the Western Front, and they, to a man, failed. They tried everything. They tried shelling for weeks at a time, shelling for hours at a time, creeping barrages, undermining entire sections of the trench and just blowing them all to hell with an explosion so loud it could be heard in England. They tried bombing, they tried gas, they tried tanks. And in the end, do you know what ended the First World War? A blockade and a strike of the factory workers. Germany was squeezed white by the blockade, and the people at home had enough of the dying and the losses and doing things like melting down the church bell that had rung over their town for centuries so the army could have another couple brass casings to fire in France. The people had had enough of starving and sending their young men to be butchered in Flanders, in Ypres, on the Somme, the Marne, and outside of Paris. The will of the Central Powers was simply broken down. Their empires toppled, and that is how the second most tragic war in history came to an end. Not on the battlefield, but in the rear. French whistles.